Yeah, as Paul has just said, we're talking about a system tonight that we currently spend around about £100 billion per year on as a country, which, to put that in context, is more than we spend on all of our education. It's more than we spend on all of our national defence and police force combined. So it's a huge part of what the government does. It's a huge part of our attempts to contain what would otherwise be many cases of very severe poverty. So there's at any one point in time around 2 million households who get pretty much all of their income from this source. But actually the reach of the system and its importance goes far wider than that. If we take universal credit, which is obviously the major reform in this area at the moment, the one everyone's talking about, well, around 1 in 3 of all working age households are expected to be getting some universal credit once that's fully rolled out. And actually, I think even that, in some ways, in some important ways, underplays the true breadth of this system, because it's a system which many people at some point in their life will get support from. In fact, we've done some work showing that most people will at some point receive a working age benefit. So it's a system that doesn't just support an unchanging minority of the population, it supports actually most of us at some point in our life, whether it's when we have children or ill health, or have a temporary period of low income, or a period of high housing costs, or whatever it is. And actually, this is still true if we exclude things like child benefit, which have traditionally been universal, and if we focus only on the traditionally means-tested income-related benefits. More than 50% of people will at some point be in a household that gets one. So that's a rough sense of just how important all of this is. Of course, it's got a lot bigger over time. We haven't always spent £100 billion on it. This shows you that. If you, other than the recent period since the peak after the recession, you can see that spending on working age benefits has been on a pretty much continuous upward trajectory for decades. And actually, overall, in real terms, we're spending at the moment more than 3 times as much as we were back in the late 70s. Obviously, we're richer as a country, we have more income to spend than we did back then, but even as a proportion of national income, we're spending almost twice as much as we were back then as a proportion of all of our income. Now, as we've massively grown this system, we've also really reshaped it. And I think this is quite an important aspect in which that's true. I'm splitting that real terms rise in spending over time into 3 broad components. Means-tested payments, which are the ones that you get in light of having a low enough income at the particular point when you're assessed. Contributory payments, which you get in light of having made contributions in some way into the system in the past. And then other payments, these are essentially ones that you can get irrespective of your current income or past contributions if you satisfy some other condition, like in the case of the traditionally universal child benefit or the so-called extra costs disability benefits. And what you can see here is that the rise of the welfare state for those of working age is mostly about the rise of means testing. So we've got to a situation now where more than a clear majority, 60% of all of this spending goes on means tested benefits, whereas just a few decades ago it was a very small minority of the system. But one of the reasons why I'd like to show this chart at the outset actually is not just because it gives you a good sense of how we've got to where we are, but actually it immediately brings up all of the core trade-offs and tensions that we've been grappling with in this policy area for decades and will continue to do so because they're unavoidable. So you take the means-tested elements of the system. These have the advantage that you can target support on those who seem to need it most at any point in time and contain the cost in that way. And clearly, evidently from this picture, we've often found that a pretty irresistible argument. When we've wanted to, for example, reduce child poverty quickly, means testing has been a very convenient way of doing that in a way that limits the cost and ensures that we can expand into entitlements to a broad set of families, irrespective of whether they've previously contributed to the system, for example. But other countries have made different choices there. They have a different balance between these elements, and that's because there are trade-offs. Means-tested payments have downsides. A key one, of course, is that you have to withdraw support from people as their resources rise, and that can create some perverse incentives for decisions around working and saving and some other things. You avoid those downsides with contributory payments, and there are some other upsides, like perhaps getting people to feel more bought into the system, making explicit that link between what people are paying in one period and getting out in another period when they're in harder times. But they have the obvious downside that you can't then focus support on groups who you think are in need unless they've made contributions to the system in the past. And the other payments, well, they avoid those problems, but they mean that you can't channel resources in some of the more fine-tuned ways that the other two forms of support allow you to do. So there are trade-offs all over the place here, and I think even just looking at this chart brings many of them to mind. And of course, these are trade-offs that we at IFS, along with many others around the world, have been grappling with for a long, long time. An absolutely core example of this for our work would be trying to figure out how we can play clever tricks with policy to maximize the upsides and minimize the downsides when thinking about the effects of incentives. Where do incentives matter most? Who responds most to them? Where do they matter least? Who responds least to them? Where do we least need to worry about those incentives? And so I'm bringing up here some of the countless examples of IFS research on how people respond to incentives when making decisions about work. And this is part of a vast international literature on the topic. And my point here really is that we've learned a lot from this. We've learned things like single parents tend to respond quite a lot to incentives relative to other groups, so that's a group worth worrying about when we're thinking about financial incentives. And facts like that have helped us to design policy a little bit better. They certainly inform the design of our tax credit system. But all of this research starts from the acknowledgement that there are some core trade-offs here, and all we can try and do is manage them as best we can. You can't get rid of them. And of course, often in popular and political debate, that tends to get lost. Tends to sound like there are easy answers when there aren't. So I think it would be a dereliction of duty for me not to point that out somewhere towards the beginning of this evening, because actually some of these core tensions are going to be at the heart of any discussion like this that is had at any point in history. But I want to move on to use the rest of my short time here, perhaps to help more directly stimulate some of the discussion we might have afterwards, which is and I want to pick out three big areas of challenge that I see for working age benefits going forward. And of course, the thing on everyone's mind probably is universal credit. I could easily be talking about some of the challenges that that's trying to address, the lack of integration, the complex patchwork of a system we have. And I could also easily talk about all of the challenges that we're clearly having implementing universal credit. And I suspect we will talk about that afterwards. And actually, partly for that reason, I want to zoom out a little bit more and think, I would argue, somewhat bigger picture. There are some underlying challenges which affected the system that universal credit is replacing, and they will carry on affecting the system under universal credit, even if universal credit goes perfectly from here on in. So I want to talk about those. Essentially, this is about what the benefit system does about three overlapping groups of people that I'm going to pick out. Of course, this isn't exhaustive. People who are in work but not earning very much, people who need support for the cost of their housing, and people with an incapacity or a disability. So I want to spend the rest of my short time talking briefly through each of these. Let's take the first one. So this shows you what proportion of our working age benefits bill is going to households where at least one adult is in paid work over time. I'm going to start this in the mid-1990s. And essentially it's gone up a lot, from a minority back then of 40% to a clear majority of almost 60% now. So that's a big change. Now, in large part, this does just reflect the wider change in the nature of who is poor in the UK. We have a benefit system that's trying to focus resources on those who need it most, and more of those towards the bottom of our income distribution now are in paid work than was in the past. So let me just show you that explicitly. This shows you back in the mid-90s, if you take the population who were in poverty and in a working age household, that just over half of those were in a workless household. So poverty then was primarily a question of worklessness for the working age population. If we wind that forward to today, that's fallen to a third. Most of this poverty is among people in a household where at least one adult is in paid work. So why is this? This is partly due to some very good news. Part of the major reason why that green segment has got much smaller is because there are many fewer workless households. And we do have good evidence that actually benefits policy can take some of the credit for that. And at least there are several good there are at least a couple of good examples of that. One would be the tax credit system, which in large part due to work at the IFS, we know seems to have been successful in moving some groups into work who wouldn't otherwise have been there, particularly single parents. But It's not just because of that. One of the reasons why that orange segment has grown so rapidly is because amongst those who are in work, as we all know by now, pay growth has been so poor, particularly at the bottom end. And we've actually been increasingly using in-work cash transfers as a way of trying to plug that gap left behind by a lack of pay growth. Let me just show you that point explicitly now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take everyone who is in a household where at least one adult is in paid work. I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to do that 20 years ago. And I'm going to look at what's happened across the distribution to earnings and incomes. So to explain, if I bring up the first line, what this is essentially telling you is that if you look at household earnings only, before taxes and before benefits, and you look towards the top of the distribution at the 95th percentile, what you find is that household earnings there are about 40% higher after adjusting for inflation than they were 20 years ago for otherwise similar households back then. If you look towards the bottom, you see almost no change in the amount that is being earned. And the key point I want you to now take away is if you contrast that very steep slope you see here, essentially clearly increasing earnings inequality, with what you see if we instead look at total income after taxes, but including, importantly, cash transfers. What you see then is basically a flat line. The difference is mostly because of the expansion of tax credits and slightly more generally in-work cash transfers, which have topped up the earnings of low-earning households over this period. So you might think, well, given that we've got an increase in earnings inequality, which we've had, that's clearly a deeper problem. But given that, the benefit system has done all it can here. We should see this as a triumph because we've remarkably contained what would otherwise have been quite a significant increase in inequality. At a considerable cost, of course, and one has to wonder whether that would continue to be sustainable indefinitely if earnings inequality increases. But nevertheless, it's in some ways a remarkable achievement. So what's the challenge for benefits policy exactly here? So I would take you back to tax credits. Originally, when we brought tax credits in, I think there were three broad positive effects that we hoped for and perhaps expected. One was to increase employment amongst certain groups, and there's good evidence that we succeeded. One was to top up the incomes of those not earning much to a more acceptable level, and this graph suggests clearly that it's done that. But there was another, perhaps more profound effect that we thought might materialize, which was that by building up people's attachment to the labour market, getting some people to spend more time in work, particularly during the parenting years perhaps, they would end up with more experience and their careers would progress. Work was a stepping stone. We'd get them into work, and from there we could address low pay because they'd build up more experience and attachment, and we'd see wage growth. In other words, what was hoped is that tax credits could perhaps not just plug the gap between these two lines, but might actually play a role in raising the bottom line up in the long term. And what we've increasingly learned is that that doesn't seem to happen. Essentially, over the last 20 years or so, we've increasingly been able to see, partly because we've got better data that allows us to look at this, that towards the bottom end of the labour market, people can spend a lot of time in paid work and still see no progression. They don't see the kind of progression that groups on higher wages and higher levels of education will tend to see when they're in work. And so actually the stepping stone story doesn't seem to have materialized very much at all. What happens is you move people into work, that may well be better than what we had before, but they don't then take off. They stay on low pay and often on tax credits. So one challenge for the benefit system is there anything that it can do to improve that particular situation? With universal credit, we're trying. There are various trials going on right now that are essentially extending both what we require of working claimants of universal credit in terms of looking for higher paid work or taking steps to do that, and the kind of help that can be available for them in doing that. We don't yet know whether that's going to have the intended effects or not, or whether it will have some unintended effects. That's clearly one key issue. Another one would be part-time work. A lot of the work that we've done recently looking at the gender pay gap has shown that pay progression in part-time work is particularly bad. Often our benefit system actually structures incentives to encourage part-time work. So one open but I think very relevant question is, have we got the balance right there, given that we know that that kind of work is particularly bad for progression. And is there anything else that our benefit system can do as part of what clearly needs to be a much wider assault on low pay and low pay progression? So I think that's the first broad area of real challenge for the system that I would raise. Challenge 2 is support for housing costs. So this shows you what's happened to real spending on housing benefit over the last 20 years or so. And it's quite incredible that it's more than doubled. So we are spending far, far more than we were even a short time ago. This is for a number of reasons that are putting upward pressure on the housing benefit bill. A key one, particularly in the more recent years, is the huge growth in the size of the relatively high rent private rented sector as home ownership falls and also cheaper social housing is in decline. So this leaves benefits policy with a pretty unpalatable dilemma given these huge underlying upward pressures on housing costs. It either has to continue to foot the extra bill for that, or it has to allow, in some cases, pretty low income and potentially vulnerable households to foot more of the bill. And what we've started to do more recently is move towards the latter approach. And you can actually see in recent years spending coming down. That's going to be partly because of wider economic trends, but there's a key role here for a change in policy. What we've basically done is broken the link between support for housing costs and the actual cost of housing. So let me just show you that here. I'm going to take the private rented sector, where overall this has been most significant. Take an example of 3-bed properties and families deemed entitled to those. And I'm going to start the story in 2012. So actually this is already just after some pretty big cuts to housing benefit, but I'm going to start the story here because that's the last time when there was an explicit link between the amount of housing benefit you could claim and the actual level of rents in your local area. So specifically, the housing benefit cap that applied to you was equal to the 30th percentile of local rents. In other words, wherever you lived in the country, you were somewhere on that 45-degree line. So let's take the example of someone in Greater Liverpool. The 30th percentile of rents there was about £120 a week, and so they could claim that much in housing benefit. Reading was a higher rent area, just over £200 a week, but you could claim that much in housing benefit. The only exceptions to this were a few areas in London, which I've brought up with dots here. They weren't on the 45-degree line because they were affected by overall national caps of £340 per week. I've left central London off this graph completely because it's so off the scale that you can't see what's going on in the rest of the country. So what happened after 2012-13? Well, we stopped linking housing benefit caps to actual housing costs. We increased them first of all by the CPI, which is also the longer run intention going forward, and then by 1% per year, and then by 0% per year during the recent benefits freeze. So what's happened? Housing benefit support has fallen behind the cost of housing. This is the picture for all of the relevant localities in England in 2016-17. And we wind forward another 3 years and we see, again, housing benefit falling further and further behind the cost of housing. So this really does raise the question of whether this is sustainable. If these dots move ever further south as rents increase, then low-income households are being asked to pay more and more of the burden of higher housing costs. It also leads to some pretty anomalous situations between people living in different areas as well. So to take an example of people living in the Cherwell Valley in Oxfordshire versus Cambridge. So back in 2012-13, rents were higher in the Cherwell Valley than in Cambridge. And because since then we haven't allowed housing benefit to change in line with rents, you can still claim more housing benefit in the Cherwell Valley than you can in Cambridge. But Cambridge has seen much, much faster rent growth since 2012. It's actually far more expensive now to rent in Cambridge than the Cherwell Valley. So housing costs more, but you can claim less support for it. So the particular way in this is being done is certainly creating some pretty anomalous situations. But more generally, I think you have to question whether this is really sustainable to break this link in this way. And in fact, whether it's coherent to have a system of support for housing costs that bears no relation to the cost of housing. So, challenge 3, the third and final challenge. Just about got time to talk about incapacity and disability. The first way I want to introduce this one is to ask you to contrast all of the stories we hear about pretty regularly of what sound like real injustices in some cases, the difficulties faced by those trying to get into the system and those living within it, with the fact that that's all happening at a time when we're spending massively more on these benefits than we were just a few years ago. So I'll show you that here. This shows you for working age spending on two groups of benefits, incapacity and disability benefits, what happened to spending over a 6-year period from 2010. Okay, so the incapacity benefits are the ones that you can claim if you're out of work, if your health is deemed to limit your ability to work. Disability benefits are the benefits that you can get irrespective of work status, essentially if your health is deemed to give you extra costs of living. And first of all, to look at what was expected to happen to spending in these two cases, back in the 2012 autumn statement by the OBR, incapacity benefit spending was expected to fall by about a quarter, and disability benefit spending was also expected to fall slightly. And in both cases, key here were the fact that we were reforming these benefits, essentially reassessing people's health in a different way. And it was expected that fewer people would be deemed to be eligible for them, and fewer people would be deemed to be getting higher rates, to be eligible for higher rates. What's actually happened, rather than falling dramatically, incapacity benefit spending has risen a bit, and rather than falling a bit, disability benefit spending has massively increased, 50% in a 6-year period. Okay, and as I said, largely this is because those reforms have turned out to have completely different impacts to what was expected. But my broader point here is that if we're hearing about all the difficulties that we're hearing about at a time when spending is rising rapidly, that suggests either huge underlying pressures on the system or incredible difficulty identifying who should get help and how best to get it to them, and probably some combination of the two. To get a little bit more specific, finally, there are two key ways I want to show you in which the nature of the problem has changed. It's the moving target, which probably makes it even more difficult to deal with. So this is showing you the proportion of the population on incapacity benefits over time for two groups. Broadly speaking, the lower educated young group and a higher educated older group. So back in the late 1990s, older age was the key predictor of being on one of these benefits. So you're much more likely to be on them if you're older and high educated than if you're younger and low educated. If we wind that forward, what we've seen is a pretty much continual reversal of that pattern. So this means two things. First of all, we have a system which used to largely support people towards the end of working life in the period before they could start claiming their pension, and it's now supporting large numbers of people in their 20s and 30s. And in addition to that, education has become a really key predictor of whether you're on these benefits. So it's a group that increasingly looks like they face big challenges in the labour market over and above just their own poor health. And lastly, and probably related to some of the trends you've just seen, is the changes in the nature of the problems that people have. So this shows you the almost continual rise in the proportion of incapacity benefit claimants that are there because their main health condition at the start of their claim is a mental or behavioural one. It's now more than half of all of these cases. So there are real, and it seems pretty clear that we are struggling in some cases even to know how to assess these people's health, never mind how best to help and support them. So those are my three big challenges. There are obviously lots more, but that's a starter for 10. I want to just leave you with one broader point. I'm sure this has been occurring to you, kind of hope it has been occurring to you at various points, which is that obviously in all of these cases, the benefit system would have a much easier job if we could do better at solving the underlying problem, right? Whether it's low pay or cost of housing or ill health and the employment prospects of people in ill health. But that's not an accident. Welfare is in large part a patch, a £100 billion patch currently that we are applying to problems that we haven't yet found a deeper or better way of addressing. So I'll leave you with that point as we move into discussion.